The world remembers the cowboy for the noise he made, the roar of his six-gun, the thunder of 1,000 hooves, the hoop and holler of a Saturday night in a cattle town. But that was only 10% of his life. The other 90% was spent in a silence so vast and profound it could break a man's mind. It was a silence born of the endless sky and the unbroken horizon of the American West. I learned this not from a history book, but from a small water-stained diary I found in a dusty antique store in Guthrie, Oklahoma. It belonged to a young man named Jake Miller, a greenhorn on his first and only cattle drive up the Cimarron Star Trail in 1883. Jake's early entries were filled with the breathless romance of a boy living his dream. He wrote of the grand adventure, the freedom of the open range, the raw beauty of a world untouched by fences. From the Diary of Jacob Miller, April 1883, leaving the Red River behind us, 3,000 longhorns ahead, a dozen good men at my side, and all of Montana waiting at the end of the trail. The sky is so big you feel you could fall right into it. Every morning, the smell of coffee and bacon on the campfire feels like a promise. This is freedom, the kind of freedom they write songs about. I feel I could ride forever and never tire of the sight. He was in love with the idea of the cowboy, the mythos. He saw the vastness as a canvas for his adventure. What he didn't yet understand was that a canvas can also be a void. He described the other men in the crew, the gruff trail boss, the wisecracking cook, and a man named Silas, a veteran drover who rarely spoke, his face a road map of sun and sorrow. Jake, in his youthful exuberance, tried to fill the quiet spaces with chatter, asking questions, telling stories of his home back in Missouri. He was met mostly with patient nods and single-word answers. He didn't realize they weren't being unfriendly. They were conserving a precious resource he didn't even know was finite. The energy of the soul. The silence of the plains was not passive. It was an active, pressing force, and these men had long ago learned that you don't shout into a hurricane. You learn to bend with it. Jake's first lesson was about to begin, not with a stampede or a river crossing, but with the slow, creeping realization that he was utterly, terrifyingly alone in a crowd of men.
After 2 weeks on the trail, the romance began to rust. The rhythm of the drive became a hypnotic, soul-crushing monotony. Wake before dawn, eat, ride, eat, ride, sleep, repeat. The landscape, once a symbol of freedom, became a prison of sameness. The same endless grass, the same merciless sun, the same horizon that never seemed to get any closer. The silence began to assert its dominance. It wasn't just an absence of noise. It was a presence. Jake's diary entries changed. From the Diary of Jacob Miller, May 1883. The world has gone quiet. For hours on end, the only sounds are the plodding of hooves, the creak of my saddle, and the lowing of the cattle. The men ride in their own worlds. A man can go a whole day and speak less than 20 words. At first, I thought they were angry. Now I see they are just empty. The trail drains the words out of you. The sky is too big for talk. I find myself humming the same tune for hours just to hear a human sound, even if it's my own. This was the big empty, as the old-timers called it, a psychological condition born of sensory deprivation and isolation. A man's thoughts, with nothing external to anchor them, would begin to drift and then to turn inward, often in dangerous ways. Jake wrote of seeing shapes in the heat haze that weren't there, of imagining conversations, of feeling a desperate, clawing need for a simple, meaningful exchange. He was starving, not for food, but for connection. The men weren't his enemies, but they weren't his saviors either. They were all just men adrift on the same silent ocean, each clinging to his own piece of driftwood. It was in this state of quiet desperation that Jake discovered his first anchor, the first tool cowboys used to fight the silence, the silent friendship with a horse. His horse was a steady, warm, living presence in a world that felt dead and indifferent. He began to talk to him, not expecting an answer, but simply to hear his own voice speak of things other than cattle and dust. The horse, with a flick of its ear or a soft nuzzle, would listen without judgment, a four-legged confessor on the lonely plains.
The horse was a balm for the soul during the long, silent days, but it was the campfire that saved men's minds at night. As the sun bled out across the horizon, the crew would draw together around the flickering flames of the chuck wagon fire. The vast, intimidating world of the day shrank to the size of this small, warm circle of light. Here, in this temporary haven, the unspoken rules of the daytime were relaxed. Here, a man could be human again. This was the second tool against loneliness, the ritual of the story. They weren't grand, heroic tales. They were small, personal vignettes, told in a low, rambling fashion. A story about a funny-looking dog in a town back in Texas, a memory of a particularly good meal, a humorous account of a past mistake on another drive. These stories were not for entertainment. They were a form of psychological communion. Each story was a declaration. I was someone before this trail. I have a past. I exist beyond this dust and this silence. Jake, initially a listener, slowly began to understand the importance of this ritual, as he noted in his diary. From the diary of Jacob Miller, late May 1883. The fire is like a church. During the day, we are just riders. At night, we are men again. Tonight, Silas spoke. He talked for nearly 5 minutes, the most I've ever heard him say. He told a story about a stubborn mule he once owned that wouldn't cross a river unless you sang "Oh, Susanna" to it. The men laughed, not a loud laugh, but a low, warm chuckle. For a moment, we weren't a trail crew. We were just friends, sharing a story. I felt my own shoulders relax. The weight of the silence lifted, if only until the fire died down. It's the stories that keep the big empty from swallowing us whole. Silas, the quiet veteran, was a master of this ritual. He knew when a story was needed, not to break the silence, but to shape it into something meaningful. He was teaching Jake and the other young hands that loneliness was a beast that thrived in isolation. By sharing these small, seemingly insignificant pieces of themselves, they were weaving a net of shared experience, a fragile but vital defense against the void. They were reminding each other and themselves that they were not just specks of dust on an indifferent landscape, but men with histories, memories, and a shared humanity.
But stories were for the night. The days still belonged to the silence. As the drive pushed north into the vast, unpopulated territories, a new, more potent form of defense was required. This was the cowboys' most famous and most misunderstood tool, the lonesome song. Modern folk imagine cowboys singing upbeat, happy tunes. The reality was the opposite. The songs of the cattle trail were overwhelmingly melancholic, mournful ballads of lost love, distant homes, and dying cowboys. Jake was confused by this at first. Why sing a sad song when you already feel low? From the diary of Jacob Miller, June 1883. Today was hard. A cold rain fell all morning. and the world was just a gray smear. I felt the loneliness so deep it was like a physical ache in my chest. Then I heard it. Silas, riding point, began to sing. It wasn't a song, really. It was more like a low, mournful chant. The melody was simple. The words were sad. "Oh, bury me not on the lone prairie where the wild coyotes will howl o'er me." He sang it over and over, his voice thin against the wind. It should have made me feel worse, but it didn't. It was like he had reached into my own chest, taken out the sadness I couldn't name, and given it a voice. It was a relief. Jake had stumbled upon the profound psychological truth of the cowboy ballad. The purpose of these sad songs was not to create sorrow, but to validate it. The act of singing about loneliness was an act of defiance against it. It externalized the internal pain, transforming a shapeless, terrifying emotion into something tangible, a melody, a verse, a shared experience. When a cowboy sang, "I'm a poor, lonesome cowboy and I'm a long way from home," he was speaking not just for himself, but for every man who could hear him. It was a way of saying, "I feel this, and I know you feel this too. We are alone, but we are alone together." The songs acknowledged the darkness, and in doing so, they robbed it of its power. The sound of a single sad voice was a beacon of humanity against the crushing silence of the indifferent plains.
The trail was a relentless crucible, and it tested every man's breaking point. The coping mechanisms, the bond with a horse, the campfire stories, the lonesome songs were essential, but sometimes they weren't enough. There were moments when the big empty won, when a man's mind would simply snap under the strain of the solitude. Jake witnessed this firsthand, an experience that burned itself into his memory and his diary. His name was Billy, a young rider not much older than Jake, who had been growing quieter and more withdrawn for weeks. He stopped joining the circle at the campfire. He stopped talking to his horse. He just rode, his eyes fixed on a point on the horizon that no one else could see. The men gave him space, a respectful distance afforded to a man wrestling with his own demons. But one evening, as the crew was settling down, Billy suddenly stood up, his eyes wild. He began shouting at the setting sun, screaming nonsensical accusations, his words swallowed by the vastness. He was arguing with the silence itself. From the diary of Jacob Miller, late June 1883. Billy broke tonight. It was the most terrifying thing I have ever seen. He wasn't violent. He was just gone. The trail boss and Silas went to him. They didn't grab him or shout. Silas just stood before him, calm as a statue, and waited for the screaming to die down. When Billy finally fell to his knees, sobbing, Silas put a blanket over his shoulders and handed him a cup of coffee. No words were said, none were needed. We all knew. The big empty had claimed him. The boss said he'll ride with him back to the nearest fort in the morning. He's too trail gone to continue. The incident was a stark reminder of the stakes. This wasn't a game. The loneliness was a predator, stalking the edges of their sanity. The quiet compassion shown by Silas and the trail boss was another unwritten rule. There was no shame in breaking. The shame was in letting a man break alone. They had lost a hand, but they had saved a man. The event solidified Jake's understanding. The Cowboys' fight wasn't against the land or the elements. It was a fight to hold on to the fragile threads of one's own mind. And the tools of that fight were not guns and ropes, but empathy, patience, and the quiet grace of a shared cup of coffee in the face of an overwhelming void.
As the drive wore on, another more private ritual became Jake's lifeline, the act of writing. Letters home were more than just communication. They were an act of self-affirmation. To write "Dear Mother" was to remember a world of homes and families, a world beyond the endless horizon. The physical act of forming words on paper, of describing the strange beauty and the profound hardship, was a way to process the experience, to give it shape and meaning. But it was a difficult translation. How do you describe a silence that is a living thing? How do you explain a loneliness that feels as big as the sky? From a letter by Jacob Miller, July 1883, Dear Mother, we have crossed into Wyoming territory. The land is rougher here, with hills that look like sleeping giants. The days are long. I am well and eating regularly. The work is hard but honest. It is difficult to explain what it is like out here. There is a great deal of quiet. I find myself thinking of your garden, the sound of the bees and the flowers. Such a small sound, but it seems so loud in my memory now. I hope you and Father are well. Your loving son, Jacob. He couldn't say it directly. He couldn't write, Mother, I am so lonely, I fear I am disappearing. Instead, he wrote of small sounds, a desperate reach for a memory of a connected world. One evening he saw Silas by the fire, painstakingly writing a letter of his own. The big, calloused hands that could expertly handle a rope or calm a spooked horse moved the pencil with slow, deliberate care. Out of curiosity, Jake asked who he was writing to. Silas looked up, and for the first time, Jake saw not a hardened cowboy, but just a man. My daughter, Silas said softly. She's about your age. I tell her about the stars. Out here, you feel closer to them. That simple statement was a revelation for Jake. Silas wasn't immune to the loneliness. He had just learned how to navigate it better. He found beauty where Jake saw emptiness. He looked up, not just out. He used his letters not to complain about the silence, but to describe the unique wonders it revealed, like the clarity of the night sky. Writing was a way to anchor oneself to a specific time and place, to create a personal narrative in the midst of an impersonal landscape. It was a declaration against the void. I am here, I am seeing this, I am still me.
The final test of a cowboy's soul often came during the night watch. Riding a slow, circular path around the sleeping herd, a man was truly, completely alone. The campfire was a distant spark, the other men just sleeping shapes. It was just the rider, his horse, the cattle, and the immense, star-dusted darkness. Here, the big empty was at its most intimate. It whispered doubts, dredged up regrets, and magnified fears. To survive the night watch, a cowboy needed to have mastered all the tools of his psychological trade. Jake's first few night watches were ordeals of terror. Every shadow seemed to hold a predator. Every coyote howl sounded like a demon. His own thoughts became his worst enemy. But as the weeks turned into months, he began to apply the lessons he had learned from Silas and the others. He talked to his horse, Shadow, his whispers a comforting rumble in the dark. He hummed the lonesome trail songs, not loudly, but as a soft mantra to keep the darkness at bay. He would recall the stories told around the campfire, replaying them in his mind. He was learning to fill the silence not with panicked noise, but with quiet intention. From the Diary of Jacob Miller, August 1883. My turn on watch. 2 o'clock in the morning. The herd is quiet, a great breathing shadow under the moon. A month ago, this silence would have terrified me. Tonight, it feels peaceful. The stars are so bright, they seem close enough to touch. I can see every constellation Silas pointed out. I don't feel alone anymore. I feel like a part of something, a small, quiet part of a very big, quiet world. It's a strange feeling. The silence hasn't gone away, but I am no longer afraid of it. I think I am finally learning its language. This was the ultimate transformation. The cowboy did not conquer loneliness. He learned to coexist with it. He integrated it. He found a strange, monastic peace in the solitude he once feared. The silence, once a terrifying void, became a space for contemplation. By being stripped of all external distractions, a man was forced to confront himself, his own strengths and weaknesses. The night watch was the final examination. Surviving it and finding a measure of peace within it was a cowboy's graduation. He had faced the big empty and had found in its heart a quiet, resilient piece of his own soul.
When the Cimarron Star Drive finally reached the lush valleys of Montana, the sudden explosion of noise and civilization was a shock to the system. The clamor of the rail town, the train whistles, the saloon pianos, the shouting voices felt alien and abrasive. After months of living in a world of subtle, natural sounds, the noise of humanity was a deafening roar. Jake found himself recoiling from it, seeking the quiet edges of the town. The very thing he had once craved, connection, conversation, society, now felt overwhelming. From the Diary of Jacob Miller, September 1883. We delivered the herd. We got paid. The men who were silent for months are now loud and drunk in the saloon. They are shedding the trail like a snake sheds its skin. I tried to join them, but the noise was too much. The piano felt like it was hammering inside my skull. I find myself walking by the river, where the only sound is the water. It's strange. For 3 months I dreamed of this. Now I find myself missing the quiet. I miss the simple company of my horse. I miss the stars. This was the final ironic lesson of the trail. The silence, once an enemy to be fought, had become a sanctuary. The journey had fundamentally rewired him. He had learned that loneliness and solitude were not the same thing. Loneliness was a painful lack of connection, an ache. Solitude, the state he had achieved on the night watch, was a peaceful, centered state of being alone. He sought out Silas, finding him not in the boisterous saloon, but sitting on a corral fence, mending a piece of leather, perfectly content in the quiet chaos of the stockyards. It gets in your bones, don't it, the quiet? Jake nodded, not needing to say more. Silas understood. Some men can't never go back. They spend their pay and sign on for another drive. They get addicted to the big empty. It's a hard life, but it's a simple one. You always know who you are out there. Silas was giving him a choice and a warning. Jake could dive back into the loud world, or he could accept that a part of him would forever belong to the silent plains. The trail gave a man a unique kind of strength, but it often took away his ability to live comfortably in the world he had left behind.
In the end, Jake did not sign on for another drive. The final page of his diary, written a month later from his home in Missouri, reveals his choice. He went home, but he was not the same boy who had left. He carried the silence of the plains within him, not as a burden, but as a source of strength. From the Diary of Jacob Miller, October 1883. I am home. The world is full of sounds I never noticed before. The ticking of the clock, the chatter of neighbors, the rustle of leaves. They are beautiful. But sometimes, when the noise gets too loud, I walk out to the fields at night and look at the stars, and I can feel it again. The big empty. It no longer scares me. It feels like an old friend.
The trail was the hardest thing I have ever done. It taught me that loneliness is a shadow, but a man is not his shadow. I learned that true companionship is not about constant talk, but about a shared silence. I learned that a sad song can heal a sad heart, and I learned that the loudest truths are often spoken in the quietest moments. My adventure is over, but I will carry the sound of that silence with me for the rest of my days.
The story of the cowboy is not one of conquest over the land, but of survival within it. Their greatest victory was not in delivering a herd, but in delivering their own minds intact to the end of the trail. They fought their loneliness with the simple, profound tools of humanity: a bond with an animal, a shared story, a mournful song, a quiet act of compassion, and a letter home. They were men who, faced with an overwhelming silence, learned not only to endure it, but to listen to what it had to teach them about themselves and the vast, beautiful, and lonesome world they rode through. Their legend is not in the noise they made, but in the quiet strength they found when there was no noise at all.